It was the most produced main battle tank of the Cold War. Over 25,000 T-72s rolled out of Soviet factories, spreading like steel seeds of war across continents. From the frozen plains of Eastern Europe to the burning deserts of Iraq, this single machine became the armored symbol of Soviet power, and its most haunting mistake. To NATO analysts, the T-72 was a terrifying unknown, a low-slung beast that could cross rivers, fire on the move, and swarm Western armor in overwhelming numbers. It was the face of the Red Army's promise: fast, cheap, unstoppable. But to the men who actually fought inside it, the story was far darker. For beneath that cold steel exterior lay a flaw, so lethal it turned the tank into a death trap. One hit, and in a flash, the turret could blast skyward like a cannonball. The crew vaporized in an instant. Western soldiers gave it a cruel nickname: the Jack-in-the-Box. The T-72 was built for victory, but its design sentenced thousands of tankers to die before they ever saw the enemy. And yet, decades later, it's still fighting. From Chechnya to Syria, from Ukraine to the Middle East, the T-72's shadow refuses to fade. This is not just the story of a tank. It's the story of how technology turned on its creators. The year was 1967, and the Cold War had carved the world into two iron halves. On one side stood NATO, armed with Western engineering, precision, and wealth. On the other, the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union, whose strength lay in sheer numbers and ruthless simplicity. In the minds of Soviet planners, the next great war would not be fought in deserts or jungles. It would erupt in the rolling plains of Central Europe. That vast, flat expanse, from Poland to Germany, was perfect ground for tanks. Whoever dominated it would control the heart of Europe itself. The Soviets needed a weapon that could win that war fast. They imagined thousands of armored divisions pouring westward, crushing NATO before the Americans could even mobilize. But there was a problem. Western tanks like the M60 Patton, Chieftain, and later the Leopard 1 were growing heavier, better protected, and more advanced with every year. So Moscow made a decision that would define generations of warfare. They would build a tank that wasn't just powerful. It would be cheap enough to mass-produce by the tens of thousands. A machine that any Soviet satellite state could field, train on, and throw into battle. That decision birthed the T-72, the perfect weapon for a war that never came, yet would go on to shape every war that followed. But in their race to outnumber the West, Soviet engineers made compromises they would come to regret. The T-72 would soon face its first true tests, not in Europe, but under the blistering sun of the Middle East. And that's where its legend and its curse would begin. In the early 1970s, deep inside the Soviet Union, the Ural-Vaganzavod factory in Nizhny Tagil roared to life. The Cold War was at its peak, and Soviet commanders demanded a new main battle tank that could replace the aging T-55 and T-62 fleets. The order was simple but brutal. Build us a tank that can survive nuclear war and crush NATO in one unstoppable push. Design teams under Leonid Kartsev and Valery Venediktov took the challenge personally. They envisioned a tank that could be mass-produced, easy to maintain, and lethal at close range. Every bolt, plate, and wire was chosen for function, not comfort, not luxury. The Soviet doctrine didn't believe in saving men. It believed in winning wars. The T-72's heart was a 125mm smoothbore gun, loaded automatically by a mechanical arm that replaced the human loader. This allowed the tank to shrink its crew to 3 men: commander, gunner, and driver. It also made the turret smaller, harder to hit, and faster to produce. But there was a price. The autoloader's carousel, a circular rack beneath the crew, held explosive shells directly under their feet. If that rack was pierced by an enemy round, the results were catastrophic. Soviet generals accepted that risk. To them, tanks were expendable. The men inside were, too. What mattered was that the T-72 could roll off an assembly line in days, not weeks. By 1973, hundreds were already moving westward, assigned to elite units like the Guards tank armies. Crews were drilled endlessly. In the frozen fields of East Germany and Poland, young Soviet tankers learned to drive blind through snow and mud, to fight without sleep, and to trust their machines more than themselves. Many were barely 20 years old. Few understood the flaws hidden beneath the armor. Meanwhile, Western intelligence watched with growing unease. Satellite images revealed columns of strange, low-profile tanks appearing on Soviet rail lines. But little was known about their capabilities. NATO strategists feared this new model might outgun their own, and the myth of Soviet invincibility deepened. By the mid-1970s, the T-72 was more than a tank. It was a message to the world. The Soviet Union was ready for war. But the T-72's first test would not come on the plains of Europe. It would come in a scorching desert, under a different flag, with enemies who knew its weaknesses before it even arrived. The stage was set, and soon, the world would see what happened when the T-72 met real combat. The year was 1982, and the T-72 was finally going to war. In the hands of the Syrian Arab Army, hundreds of these Soviet-made machines rolled across the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, a dry, rugged landscape of rocky ridges and blistering sun. Their target, Israeli forces advancing north during the Lebanon War. For the Syrians, this was supposed to be redemption. Only 9 years earlier, in the Yom Kippur War, older Soviet tanks had been torn apart by Israeli air power and American-made missiles. But now, they had the newest weapon Moscow could offer, the T-72. Crews were confident. Their instructors had promised this tank was nearly invincible. Its 125mm gun could destroy anything the Israelis had, even at long range. At dawn, the valley rumbled with engines. Syrian formations advanced in tight lines, black exhaust spilling into the sky. Dust clouds trailed them like ghosts. Inside, crews sweated in the metal heat, hands trembling on controls slick with oil. The first clash came swiftly. Israeli Merkava tanks and Cobra gunships struck from concealed positions. The T-72s fought back fiercely. Their powerful guns cracked the silence, sending rounds that tore through enemy armor. For a moment, it looked as though the Syrians had turned the tide. Several Merkavas burned in the valley floor. Soviet advisors watching from command posts reported triumphantly back to Moscow. The T-72 is performing beyond expectation. But that hope didn't last. Israeli spotters had been tracking the Syrian advance for hours. Guided missiles streaked down from ridgelines, hitting the T-72s from above, their weakest point. Others were caught in airstrikes, engulfed by fire before they could even return fire. Inside the tanks, crews faced a nightmare they hadn't been warned about. When a missile penetrated the armor and reached the auto-loader carousel, the ammunition ignited all at once. The turret didn't just lift, it exploded skyward, spinning into the air in a fireball of smoke and steel. Within seconds, the crew was gone. By nightfall, the once proud armored spearhead had been shattered. The survivors, dazed and burned, spoke of invisible weapons and tanks that exploded without warning. Back in Moscow, Soviet engineers received the first reports with disbelief. They had built this machine to dominate NATO, yet it was being destroyed by smaller, faster enemies using clever tactics and precision strikes. The T-72's invincible image was cracking, and with it, the myth of Soviet armor itself. But the worst was still to come. The world had only seen the beginning of what happened when a T-72 was hit. Soon, they would see the full horror, up close. The morning sun rose over southern Iraq, turning the desert into a sheet of gold and fire. It was February 1991, and the Gulf War had reached its peak. Saddam Hussein's army, one of the largest in the world, waited behind dug-in defenses of sand berms, trenches, and hundreds of T-72 tanks. They called them Assad Babel, Lions of Babylon, a proud name for a machine that had already earned a darker reputation. Across the horizon, the American-led coalition advanced, a storm of armor, aircraft, and artillery unlike anything seen before. The M1 Abrams and Challenger 1 tanks led the way, backed by A-10 Warthogs and Apache helicopters prowling above. Inside their cockpits, pilots watched through infrared screens as T-72s glowed like embers in the night. Then the desert erupted. American shells screamed through the air, 120 millimeters depleted uranium rounds, traveling at over a mile per second. When they struck a T-72, the effect was apocalyptic. The armor didn't just shatter, it melted. The projectile burned straight through, igniting ammunition and fuel. In seconds, the tank became a furnace. Some exploded so violently that the turret was launched dozens of meters away, a black silhouette against the burning sand. Inside, Iraqi crews never had a chance. Many never even saw their attackers. They died before realizing they were in range. Radio chatter dissolved into panic. "We are under fire. We can't see them." Some tanks fired blindly into the horizon, their rounds falling short. Others tried to retreat, only to be picked off one by one. For coalition soldiers watching through night vision goggles, it was surreal. The battlefield looked like a series of sudden, silent eruptions, bright flashes as T-72s vanished in seconds. One U.S. commander later said, "It wasn't a battle. It was execution." But not all the T-72s died quietly. A few Iraqi crews fought to the bitter end. They fired until their guns jammed, until the heat inside their tanks made it hard to breathe. One unit, isolated near Medina Ridge, ambushed an advancing column at close range, knocking out several American vehicles before being annihilated by return fire. In those moments, the courage of the men inside those doomed machines shone through the smoke, trapped by orders, betrayed by their technology, and still unwilling to run. By midday, the sand was littered with twisted metal and burned bodies. The air reeked of diesel, smoke, and scorched flesh. Survivors stumbled through the wreckage, their uniforms blackened, their faces pale with shock. Some stared at their destroyed tanks in silence, as if realizing, too late, that they had been sacrificed by design. When the smoke cleared, more than 600 Iraqi tanks lay destroyed in just a few days. The vaunted T-72, once the pride of Soviet engineering, had been utterly humiliated for decades. Armies around the world had believed in its strength. But on the battlefields of Iraq, that myth died under the weight of Western firepower and precision. The world had just witnessed the death of the Soviet tank doctrine and the beginning of a new kind of war, where speed, sensors, and accuracy mattered more than numbers. The realization struck Moscow like a thunderclap. The age of quantity was over. The age of technology had begun. By the time the guns fell silent, the desert was a graveyard of steel. Across the Basra Highway and the plains of Kuwait, hundreds of T-72s lay gutted, their turrets blown off, their holes split open like peeled fruit. Burnt ammunition still crackled in the wreckage. The smell of diesel and death hung thick in the in just 100 hours of ground combat. Iraq's armored forces, once numbering more than 4,000 tanks, have been reduced to wreckage. Entire brigades ceased to exist. Some crews had abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot. Others never made it out at all. Of the T-72 battalions that faced the U.S. Army's 7 Corps, over 90% were destroyed or captured. The battle that Saddam Hussein had promised would be the mother of all battles ended in utter ruin. Iraqi armor, pride of the Republican Guard, was shattered beyond repair. The Medina and Tawakkala divisions' elite formations, once feared across the Middle East, were virtually annihilated. Coalition losses were almost unthinkably low by comparison. Fewer than 10 tanks destroyed, most by friendly fire. The victory was absolute and merciless. For the soldiers who survived on both sides, the images stayed burned into memory. American crews spoke of the eerie calm after the storm, the silence of dead machines under a red sky. Iraqi survivors, captured and trembling, described watching their comrades vanish in white-hot flashes with no time to scream. When reporters finally arrived, the world saw the truth in grim detail. The myth of Soviet invincibility had ended here in the desert, not through bravery or betrayal, but through the cold arithmetic of technology. The T-72's defeat reshaped military thinking overnight. Armies that once copied its design began questioning it. The Soviets and later the Russians realized too late that what they had built for the past could not survive the wars of the future. But even in defeat, the T-72 story wasn't over. Its legacy and its flaws were about to echo again in the decades that followed. In the years that followed, the T-72's image became a paradox, both feared and pitted. It was the steel face of Soviet ambition, yet also the gravestone of its doctrine. Across the Middle East, Africa, and Eastern Europe, thousands of these tanks remained in service, passed from army to army, war to war, old ghosts fighting in new conflicts, from Chechnya to Syria, and most recently Ukraine. The pattern repeated. Columns of T-72s burned on highways, victims of drones, missiles, and precision-guided weapons. Each explosion was a grim reminder that technology had outpaced ideology, that the lessons of the past had not been learned. Still, soldiers climbed into them. Still, they fought and died inside machines designed half a century ago. Because for many nations, the T-72 wasn't just a tank. It was necessity, cheap, familiar, available. A relic that refused to die. Military historians now see it as a warning. The T-72 taught the world that numbers alone cannot win wars, that mass production without protection is a promise written in blood. It forced armies to rethink armor, crew safety, and the price of speed over survival. Yet its shadow remains. Even today, when a T-72 rolls in a battle, its silhouette carries decades of history and the quiet knowledge that for those inside, one hit may be the last, because the T-72 was never just a weapon. It was a lesson carved in fire and steel, a lesson the world keeps forgetting.